very much. Thanks for the invitation. So yeah, I'm going to talk about matching markets. But before I do, I thought I'd give you a quick overview of sort of the field I'm in, which some of you will know, and some of the particular applications and theories I'm interested in. So broadly, I work in, I guess, game theory. And the definition of a game is any interaction between two or more agents with non-identical objectives. So basically a multi-agent system. And sort of the classical game theory focuses on the incentives that affect agents in these games. So, I think I've kept this talk fairly short. So if you have questions, just interrupt me whenever you want. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, yeah. So a game is an interaction between two or more agents with non-identical objectives. They have the same objective, then really you're in a single player. Standard optimization problem. And we're interested in incentives affecting these agents. Of course, this definition is so ridiculously broad. It applies to the sort of standard motivating problems in game theory, like card games or maybe board games. It goes beyond that to basically practically everything. Obviously, I'm not going to work on practically everything, but it does mean we do have a lot of stuff we can talk about. So from a sort of computer science perspective, people have been interested in algorithmic game theory, algorithmic mechanism design. And here we're kind of more interested in mechanisms that are practical, and we're interested often in mechanisms that are sort of fair and efficient and have high performance. So from this practical perspective, one thing we're obviously interested in is computation. We want these mechanisms to be efficient in terms of computation, but that could mean, we want the mechanisms themselves to be fast, how they work. If agents and the mechanisms can communicate, that's got to be fast. If the agents are taking part, those agents must be making fast decisions and so on. So all these sorts of aspects take place. And as I mentioned, of specific interest to me, I'm going to have to sort of narrow things down a bit. I'm interested in sort of auctions and market mechanisms. So I'm going to tell you about a few sort of applications. And I'm sort of a more mathematician theory. I work on the theory side. Some of the applications, luckily, that I'm going to tell you about, the theory and the practice are fairly close together. Whereas in most other sort of applied maths, it's like that. So I don't particularly like getting my hands dirty. So this sort of area seems to be quite nice. You are quite close to applications. So for example, spectrum auctions. In a spectrum auction, bandwidth is being sold in blocks, or in places like Canada, it's also being sold in regions. And what this means is you've basically got what we call a combinatorial auction. We've got many, many items being sold simultaneously, often hundreds, often in recent US auctions, thousands and thousands of items, licenses being sold at the same time. These are really big problems. There's obviously huge, very valuable resources they're selling. In practice, there's kind of a few forms of auctions that have been effective in these settings. The most useful ones are what we call clock auctions. Essentially, the clock auction is there's a sort of a timer going on. You can think of it as a timer. And over time, the price of these items goes up. And then people drop out until whoever's left wins. That's the basic idea. And these clock auctions can use item bidding, where you basically bid on each item individually, or package bidding when you're bidding on like subsets of these items at the same time. And there's also two-sided bidding. For example, the recent incentive auctions in the US, where you have buyers and sellers taking place at the same time in these auctions. So a lot of, on the theoretical side, is trying to understand combinatorial auctions and see how they apply and can be applied in practice to these spectrum auctions. And Another thing I'm interested in is carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is a sort of predominant approach taken worldwide to combat climate change. I think you can say it's not been very effective yet. But anyway, carbon pricing has two major forms: a carbon tax, which is a price on carbon, and cap and trade, which is a quantity on carbon or a cap on carbon. And again, the classical way of viewing this is they're the same thing, right? If you put the price, you get a quantity. If you put the quantity, you get the price. In practice, there's probably reasons to believe that these things are going to be very different. So that's kind of a practical question. More theoretical question I'm interested in is these cap and trade systems. It turns out, what is a cap and trade system? How it works is you're selling this quantity of goods. And basically what you're doing is you're selling carbon permits, say, per ton of carbon that you can emit. And you're selling these permits, say, every 3 months. So what you do is you're selling them sequentially over time. So this is just what we call a sequential auction. And so if we want to understand a cap and trade system, we've got to understand sequential auctions. It turns out people do not understand sequential auctions very well at all. They're very complicated in practice, in theory. Even though this is economically the simplest problem you can do, you've got one item, identical items, identical permits selling to a group of people. That's basically Econ 101. Once you start selling them over time, we don't understand it. Okay, so that's carbon pricing. Another one I'm interested in the moment is kidney exchanges. We're actually working with Margarita on this. And here's the basic idea is we've got 2 kidneys, but you can live with 1. This means kidneys, you can actually have live transplants. You can have a living donor. So one issue, though, is, if you have a donor and a patient, you may not be able to, the donor may not be able to donate to that patient. And it could be because of blood group incompatibility or antibody incompatibilities. There are various reasons why a donor is not feasible with the patient. So in a kidney exchange program, what happens is a patient comes along with a donor, an incompatible donor, normally a spouse, a friend who's willing to give them a kidney, but they're incompatible. And so essentially what a kidney exchange program is doing is it's trading donors. Okay? It's trying to switch donors. So if patient A and donor A come along, and then there's patient B and donor B, maybe donor A can donate to patient B and donor B can donate to patient A, and they can both get a kidney. And this corresponds to what we call a matching market. You can think of the donors as being sort of the left-hand side of a bipartite graph, the patients on the right-hand side. There's an edge between them if you can match that donor to that patient, and you're trying to find a feasible matching in this graph. There's also a lot of other constraints. For example, you want your matching to have the property that if your donor gives a kidney, then that you should get one. Right? So there's other sort of constraints. There's also a time aspect. But essentially, this is a matching market. I'm going to give you a very different matching market problem in the rest of the talk. But again, these are all sorts of market situations. Again, there's no money involved in these markets. This is just some sort of exchange graph that we're trying to analyze. But it's a very nice sort of combinatorial problem. Something else I'm interested in at the moment to do with these algorithms, and that's not necessarily completely to do with game theory, but it's traditionally, like I said, we've been looking at these efficacious systems. You basically want solutions, mechanisms that give you like high welfare, good performance in these systems. And in multi-agent systems, of course, the equilibrium might be bad, and you want to change your mechanism so the equilibrium are good, things like this. But we might also be interested in mechanisms that are fair, right, and unbiased. So there's a lot of interest, especially in AI at the moment, in these sorts of questions about fairness, right? So we've got things like automated sentences. A lot of judicial sentencing, there's a lot of evidence that that's very biased against minorities. Job applications. And these are where, for example, computers might either decide on who gets the job or create a short list based on all the applications that come in. And again, these have been shown in a lot of settings to be pretty biased against women. Automated pricing, things like Amazon have these things where they give you discounts depending on where you live. Again, seem to be very biased against certain areas and regions. Yeah, 2 weeks ago, there was an interesting one with Twitter. Twitter admitted that its promotional algorithms favored right-wing politicians. And strangely enough, the bias was biggest in Canada. I don't know why. So these are all fairness issues. These are way too practical for me, to be honest. So I've kind of started thinking about this from a more theoretical perspective, but there's two aspects here that I'm looking into that there's a very subtle difference going on here, but two aspects that seem the same, but are actually quite different. One is designing algorithms or mechanisms whose inner workings are fair. So these sort of inner workings of your mechanism is fair and unbiased. And then also mechanisms and algorithms that give you fair outcomes. And they're actually very different, or they can be. Your mechanism can be fair, but produce really bad, unfair outcomes. Or your inner mechanism could be really unfair, but somehow produce fair outcomes. So that's one aspect I'm sort of trying to think about. Okay, so that's, yeah.
In automated pricing, how can one say that an algorithm is unfair because Amazon can differentiate between two consumers and
So this is the interesting thing, right? Most of these biased algorithms are not they're favoring. They're not like deliberately biased. Most of them they're just deliberately favoring some criteria that's highly correlated with something. So, for example, Amazon may offer free delivery in certain areas, and it turns out, okay, that's not this part of the city or this part, maybe that's completely fair, right? But the outcomes themselves are very unfair. So I think in most of these settings, again, in the job applications ones, none of them were saying you couldn't hire women. It was somehow whatever criteria they were using seemed to be biased in certain settings, right? And again, there's a lot of, there's a lot of work trying to deal with this stuff, but I'm not an expert on this. This is again more the motivational aspect of why people are really interested in these questions in many different fields in law, philosophy, and of course, like now in computer science, people are trying to understand what's going on. Any other questions? That's my basic intro. So now I'm going to sort of go on to the talk about matching markets, and I'm going to focus on one recent paper, which is work with Sergey, Norin, and our student Ndiaye, and it's called Descending the Stable Matching Lattice: How many strategic agents are required to turn pessimality into optimality. So I'm going to try and, I'm not going to go into super technical details, but I'll try and give you enough understanding of this problem, where it comes from, and give you an idea of what we're doing. Okay, so the stable matching problem. How many of you have seen the stable matching problem before? Okay, about half of you. Okay, good. So let me explain this problem. Okay, you're going to have n boys and n girls. So we call the boys B1 to Bn, girls G1 to Gn. And every boy is going to have a preference ordering over the girls. It's going to rank the girls from 1 to n, and every girl is going to rank the boys from 1 to n. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and pair up the boys and the girls. So they're going to go to a prom, they're going to pair up in a matching n. And that matching, though, is going to be unstable if you can find a boy B and a girl G with the following properties. Boy B prefers girl G to his partner assigned to him by the matching, and girl G prefers boy B to her partner assigned to her by the matching. I'll give you an example in a moment. But essentially, this is going to be unstable because this is what we call a blocking pair for the matching. Basically, B and G look at their current partners and say, no, I'd prefer to break up with those and go together. So it breaks the matching. And so a stable matching is a matching that has none of these blocking pairs. So you allowed boy B to prefer girl G to the current partner, but not simultaneously the other way around. One of them can, but they both have to want to break up for this to be unstable. Okay, so this is the stable matching problem. Again, this has quite a lot of applications. This is, again, seems a toy example of applications. I'll tell you maybe about some of them later. Let's give you an example, some fairy tale prom. It's actually a Danish fairy tale prom. Any Danes in the audience? Okay. I gave this talk in Denmark, like this example. So so who are our characters? Emperor with no clothes, ugly duckling, tin soldier, By the reindeer. I think he's called Sven in Frozen. The Snow Queen, Little Mermaid, Thumbelina, and the Little Match Girl. So we've got here, N is 4. We've got 4 boys, 4 girls. This is our matching. And we said there's going to be a ranking of the boys for each girl and so on. So I'm going to rank from left to right. So the Emperor, first choice is going to be the Snow Queen, then Thumbelina, then Little Match Girl. Last choice is Little Mermaid. On the other hand, the Snow Queen, first choice is Sven, then Ugly Duckling, then the Emperor, then the Tin Soldier. And let's do this for all the other 6 characters as well. Okay, is this a stable matching? Probably take a little while to figure this out. Okay, it's not. Okay, this is not a stable matching. And here's why. Take the Ugly Duckling and the Little Match Girl. The Ugly Duckling, second on the list is Little Match Girl. She's above Little Mermaid. So Ugly Duckling would prefer Little Match Girl. And if I look at Little Match Girl, she's currently matched with Sven the Reindeer, who's bottom of her list. So she definitely prefers Ugly Duckling. So the Duckling and the Little Match Girl prefer each other to their current partners. So if they were to see this list, they would be motivated to break with their current partners and go to the prom together. So that was not a stable matching. Okay, so the first question you might ask is, do stable matchings even exist? Can we find a stable matching? And it turns out the answer is yes. So there's a famous algorithm due to Gale and Shapley called the Deferred acceptance algorithm, which will output a stable matching, always. Yeah, I'm going to, for this talk, preferences are strict. Yeah. So here's how the algorithm works. It's going to repeat, and it's going to start with everybody's unmatched, and it's going to repeat until every boy is matched. If every boy is matched, every girl is matched, everyone's matched, and then it will stop. Okay, so what does it do? As it's running, it says, is there an unmatched boy? If there is, pick some unmatched boy B, doesn't matter which one. And let B propose to his favorite girl who's not already rejected him. So the boys are going to go down their list, and he's going to propose to the next person on his list. Okay, so he proposes to girl G. And what does girl G do? Well, what she's going to do in this algorithm is if she's unmatched, then she's going to say, okay, and she's going to tentatively match to B. So as this algorithm runs, these matches are going to be tentative. Once it finishes, we'll make them permanent. Okay. Else, if she's already tentatively matched to somebody else, say boy beta, now she's got a decision to make, and she's going to choose her favorite between B and beta. So in particular, she looks at beta and B, picks her favorite one, says, I'm tentatively going to match with you. So if she prefers B to beta, she now rejects her current tentative match beta and tentatively matches to B. If she prefers beta to B, she sticks with beta. Okay. And this process just repeats. And then when it terminates, we make these matches permanent. There's several issues here, like does this algorithm terminate? It does terminate in the sense that your boys are going down the list. It's certainly not clear when you start looking at this that actually you're going to get everyone matched and it's going to be stable matching, but you can prove, it's not too hard to prove this actually does give you a stable matching. Okay. Let's see this algorithm at work. So what do? We're starting with the empty matching. Nobody's matched. We pick an unmatched boy. How about the emperor? And what does the emperor do? He proposes to the first girl on his list, Snow Queen. Snow Queen says, well, okay, I'm unmatched. I'll match to you. You're third on my list. So that's a tentative match. Okay, now we find, okay, should we stop? No, there's an unmatched boy, ugly duckling. Let's take the ugly duckling. He proposes to the first girl on his list, Snow Queen. She now says, okay, I've got two offers. Currently with the emperor, I've got now an offer from the ugly duckling. I prefer the ugly duckling. So I'm going to reject the emperor and I'm going to tentatively match to the ugly duckling. Pick another unmatched boy. Tin Soldier proposes to Thumbelina. She says, well, you're bottom of my list, but okay. Find another unmatched boy. Sven, he says, okay, little match girl. She says, well, you're still bottom of my list, but tentatively, yes. Now, everyone's matched except the emperor. So the emperor, go to the emperor. There's no point in proposing to the Snow Queen. He's got to go because she's already rejected him. So she's going to go next choice. Second choice, he's going to go ask Thumbelina. She says, well, currently I've got the Tin Soldier. I don't really like the Tin Soldier. I prefer you. So I'm going to tentatively match to the emperor. Now the Tin Soldier's unmatched. He goes to his second choice, little match girl. She says, oh, yeah, you're top of my list. So I'm going to now reject Sven, and I'm going to tentatively match with you. Who's left? Sven is unmatched. He proposes to the Snow Queen. She says, oh, yeah, you're top of my list. So I'm going to reject the ugly duckling. The ugly duckling now is unmatched. He proposes to the little match girl. She says, no, I've already got my first choice. So now he goes further down his list. He asks Little Mermaid. She says, oh, yeah, I've not got any offers yet, so I'll accept that offer. Now everybody's matched. Okay, and the algorithm says if everybody's matched, we stop. That's our permanent match. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We stop, and it turns out that is a stable matching. If you start looking around trying to find the contradiction, you won't. This is a stable matching. So there's at least one. There is one stable matching. In fact, there could be a huge number of stable matchings. There could be an exponentially many number of stable matchings. And what's interesting, though, is you can order these matchings. So we can say that stable matching 1 is above stable matching 2 if every boy prefers their match in M1 over their match in M2. So this is quite a strict way to order them. If every boy prefers M1 to M2, their partner in M1 over their partner in stable matching M2, then we're going to say M1 is going to be above M2. And Knuth showed that if you do this, the stable matchings form what we call a distributive lattice. So you don't really need to know the technical details if you haven't seen any of this combinatoric stuff, but a lattice just means you have a meet and a join. It's a special structure of a post set. I don't think we're going to use it in the talk, although it's useful for proofs. Okay, but they form some sort of a lattice structure. There's some little structure on them, a hierarchy. And what's interesting about this is because it's a lattice, that means it's sort of a unique join and a unique meet. It means there is a top of the lattice. There is a stable matching at the very top, which we call the supremum. And that supremum, because it's at the top, that means every boy prefers their match in that, let's call it M1, the one at the top, prefers their partner in M1 to their partner anywhere else in the lattice. So we call that boy optimal. Every boy has their favorite partner amongst all their stable partners. So we say that, again, you've got an exponential maybe of stable matchings. If you look at your partners, your possibly many, many different partners amongst these matchings, let's call them your stable partners. Your favorite one is going to be for the boys at the top. I'll mention that again later. There's something, again, that's not obvious about this, but happens to be true. And again, it's not too hard to show, is that if M1 is above M2, that's because every boy prefers M1 to M2. It turns out if that happens, it also means every girl conversely prefers M2 to M1. So that means if you're boy optimal, you're girl pessimal. This is the worst possible. The supremum is the worst possible choice for the girls. On the other hand, the infimum, the bottom, is girl optimal. Every girl has their best partner they could possibly get at the bottom. Every boy has their worst partner. Yep. Yeah, there is, because this comes from the fact that there's a distributive lattice, which means basically if I take 2 points, there's a sort of unique point that's above both of them. So if there was sort of 2 points at the top, then there'd be something above them. There has to be a unique. Yeah. So this is, again, this is just only true because it's a distributive lattice. It's true because it's a lattice. But it's not true in a normal post set, but it's true of these lattices. Okay. Let me give you an example. And this is a bigger example from Irving et al. This is 8 boys, 8 girls, MW, men, women. If you've got a minute, you can calculate this. Is the stable matching lattice. Maybe it'll probably take you a couple of days, but this is what you get. Okay, there's 23 stable matchings in this particular example. Again, the way to read this is girl 1, woman 1, her first choice, man 3, then man 1, and so on. You just read across. We can run our algorithms. We can find stable matching, but it turns out there's 23 of them. Okay, and there's a unique one. M1 is the boy optimal stable matching, or the girl pessimal one, and M23 is the girl optimal. So again, definition I'll use is, because there's so many different matchings, you could have more than one stable partner. We say that there's a girl is a stable partner for the boy if she's matched to that boy in one of these stable matchings. So that means you've got 23 stable partners. Of course, because there's only 8 boys and 8 girls, there's some copying, there's duplications. But amongst these 23 stable matchings, for each boy, if you find his favorite partner in those 23 matchings, that partner is actually appearing in M1. That's why that's boy optimal. Similarly, for M23, if you look at every girl, take any girl you want, look at her favorite partner in these 23 matchings, she's matched to that boy in this matching. Okay. So that's going to be useful for us. So now let's go. I was mentioning, game theory, we're interested in these incentives. What are the incentives in these sorts of situations? It turns out if I run the deferred acceptance algorithm, then it outputs the boy optimal stable matching. It finds M1, the boy optimal supremum of that lattice. There's an interesting story about this. This algorithm was actually used before it was defined, or before it was invented. It's been used since the 50s to match residents to hospitals. And It used to, but there instead of boys and girls, you've got hospitals and residents, student residents. And to begin with, the hospitals will propose. And when people found out these results, the students complained and they switched it. So now the students propose to the hospitals. But because of this fact, because you're getting the boy optimal stable matching, it's probably not surprising that you could figure out that maybe boys should tell the truth to this mechanism. Truth telling is the best strategy, the optimal strategy for the boys. So what do I mean by optimal strategy? Imagine you've got to go give your preference list to this mechanism that's then going to spit out the stable matching. Do you give them your true list or not? Or do you try and fiddle around, switch the first and second or the fifth and the sixth? Well, for the boys, no, you should give them your whole list in the correct order. Okay, and you can formally prove that. But on the other hand, it's not so obvious with the girls. It looks like the girls have the incentive to lie. And it turns out, yeah, they're getting their worst stable partners. Maybe if they lied, they could get something better. And it turns out that's true. And it turns out the best thing that the girls can do is what we call truncading. Truncading means they take their preference list and they just give a part of the list, the top part. They're going to cut it off somewhere and just give the mechanism some piece of the list. And really where they should break it off, if you think about it, would be with their favorite stable partner, their partner they get in M23. Okay, but theoretically you could do that. In practice, you'd probably hedge a bit and give some fraction of your list and hope you've got your stable partner in it. Okay, but there, it turns out girls have an incentive to lie. And so the question is like, in practice, or how big an incentive really is it? Is it, is this just a trivial incentive? Is there much difference? What's the difference between M1 and M23? Does it make much difference? If most of them get the same partner, or there's only one difference in your ranking, maybe it doesn't matter. So we're going to try and study these incentives. And we're going to study them in a very special model called the random matching model. I guess this model is the most well-studied model for stable matchings, but I'm not going to pretend it's realistic. The idea in this random matching model is each agent, each boy or girl, just their list is random, completely permutation, random permutation. Okay, so in reality, there's going to probably be correlations between these lists and so on. If hospitals are ranking students and vice versa, there's probably a lot of correlation. But this at least is a nice model to look at. And the other thing I should say, it won't be important, I don't think it's important for the talk, but if you would ever read the proofs, what's interesting about this is Knuth et al. Showed that this sort of model can be analyzed in an online fashion. Like you don't need to give your whole list to the mechanism in advance. What you can do is the mechanism can ask you who's next on your list. And so then the boy can pick the next on the list. And then you can generate that random choice at that point in time if you're using this model. And similarly, when the girl receives the proposal, she doesn't need a whole ranking. She only needs a ranking of the people that have proposed to her so far. Maybe she's had 10 proposals. They're ranked. The 11th proposal come in. She randomly puts it somewhere in those sort of 11 possible positions. And it turns out that's completely equivalent to generating them randomly in advance. But when you do it this way, it's nicer to analyze. And okay, so then we ask the question, does strategizing have any benefits? Well, we know there might be a benefit. So does it have any significant benefit if you try the girls try to lie? And it turns out the answer is yes. There's an absolutely huge difference in the quality of the matches that the boys get using this algorithm compared to the girls. So here's a result due to Pittel. It says if you have this random matching model, remember you've got n people. When you look at each boy in expectation, he's going to be matched with his log nth favorite girl. So someone near the top of his list. In contrast, each girl in expectation is only going to be ranked to someone in sort of n over log n position on her list, way down the list. So there's a sort of dramatic difference between your expected rank. So the rank is the position on your list, first to last. There's a huge difference. So there's a big difference between M1 in my picture and M23. Okay. And here's kind of a crazy result. If only one girl lies or acts strategically and truncates her list, everything changes. So there's a recent paper from Kufa that shows if you just have one girl lying, then the girls get expected rank log n squared instead of n over log n. And the boys get expected rank n divided by log squared n about instead of log n. That's if one girl lies. If you think about that, that's kind of crazy, right? That says not only does the girl that's lying benefit from the lie, every single girl benefited from that lie quite dramatically. So one person lying benefits all of it. That concept, that idea had actually been seen before, but this has been quantified. Now this theorem seems kind of crazy, but in a sense it wasn't surprising because of there's a related result, a sort of famous result now by Schlage et al. that says a similar effect happens if you have what we call an unbalanced market. So if you have n boys and n girls, if it turns out in these random matching models, if you had one more boy, n plus one boys and n girls, you see this exact sort of same flip. Suddenly the rankings of the boys drop dramatically and the girls go way up. So somehow one girl acting strategically somehow corresponds to having either one less girl or one more boy. There's some sort of, a formal relationship, but there's some sort of correspondence going on there. Okay. Right, so intuitively, what does that mean? That means if one girl lies, you go way down the lattice. So remember, we started at boy optimal stable matching, which from the girl's perspective is girl pessimal. We start at M1. In my particular example, depending on which girl lies, you're going to end up somewhere at some different matching. If the best girl to lie would end up taking you actually to M18. And let's call that the for stable matching. You could go all the way from M1 to M18 if you pick the right girl to lie. So the question we're interested in is, well, what if we want to get all the way to the bottom? What if we want to descend the entire lattice? What if we want to get to, in this particular example, M23? How many girls do we need to lie to get to here or to act strategically? And Kufa conjectured that this is O of log n. If O of log n girls lie, then we can get to the bottom. And so that's motivated what we're going to try and work on. We actually have two results. To define them, what we need is this concept of a winning coalition. A winning coalition says a set of girls is a winning coalition if by acting strategically and truncating their lists, they can ensure that when we run the deferred acceptance algorithm, we output the girl optimal stable matching. So we want to find a set of girls that if they truncate their lists, we're at the very bottom. The algorithm, when we run the algorithm, the only place it can end up is at M23. Okay. And so what we prove informally is the expected cardinality of the minimum winning coalition, the smallest possible coalition that wins, is small. And conversely, if I pick a random coalition, if I pick some random collection of girls, the chance of them being a winning coalition is tiny unless it's a huge coalition. And basically, I'll give you the result in a second. So the first result is basically solves Kufa's conjecture. The winning coalition has expected size of half log n. There's a half log n girls in expectation that if you pick that right set, it has about size of half log n and it will get us to the bottom. On the other hand, if I pick some random collection of girls, it won't get us to the bottom unless it basically contains that subset S, contains nearly all the girls, n minus O of n, little o of n girls. So basically, if you pick the girls at random, it doesn't help that much. But if you pick them carefully, the right ones, you actually get to the very bottom with a small number. Okay, so those are our results. You can ask, how do we prove such results? Basically, when I give you this problem of the stable matchings, it doesn't look like there's any structure in them, right? There's just these preference lists. But it turns out there's this huge structure underlying the problem, like this lattice. And there's this big combinatorial structure that we can use to figure out what the incentives are. So basically, this is kind of a combinatorics probability paper I'm presenting here. But how do we do it? We look at something called the rotation graph. The rotation graph says, give me your matching. Let's say it's a stable matching M. If I have my stable matching M without loss of generality, let's say stable matching M matches boy 1 to girl 1, boy N to girl N. For that stable matching, we're going to create a graph which has a vertex for each boy. And in this graph, we're going to have an arc from boy I to boy J if girl J is the next girl on boy I's list who prefers boy I to her current partner, boy J. I'm going to give you an example of this later, but what this basically says is, if I'm boy I, if I were to go further down my list, who's the next girl that would, tentatively accept me, that prefers me to their current partner? Okay. If the first girl that would on my list as I go further down is girl J, then I'm going to have an arc from boy I to girl J's partner, who happens to be boy J. Again, I'll show you an example later, 2 examples, in fact. And when we draw this graph, then if this graph has a cycle in it, it's not surprisingly going to be called a rotation. So that's why it's going to be a rotation graph. And what's interesting about these cycles is if I take my stable matching M and I find a cycle in the rotation graph, if I switch the partners of the boys on that cycle, I get another stable matching. So here's our example. Again, I'll give you one with specific preferences later, but let's take this example. So let's say I was at M1. So M1 is my matching M, my stable matching M. This is my rotation graph. Remember, I have 8 boys, 8 girls. I've got my boys here, 1 to 8. And if I draw my rotation graph, it's this, and the red one is a cycle. So I've got this cycle of boys 1, 2, 3, and 6. And it turns out if I swap the partners cyclically, boy 1 matches to girl 2, girl 3 matches to boy 2, and so on. I rotate their partners. I go from M1 to M2. So essentially, if I find this rotation graph, I find the cycle, I rotate the partners along the cycle, I go here. I can now find the rotation graph for M2. There's some cycle in it. It will take me to M3. I draw the rotation graph for M3. Turns out I'm going to find 2 cycles. If I pick, say, the left cycle, I'll go to M4. If I rotate on the right cycle, I'll go to M5, and so on. And this way, I can get all the way down the bottom. Each time I find the rotation graph for that particular matching, and I have a certain number of cycles that each take me to a new stable matching further down the lattice. So this is how I can go from the top to the bottom by these rotations. Okay, which means essentially, if I want to understand how to get who should lie, I need to understand these rotation graphs. I need to figure out these rotations. I don't think this is that important, but I'll show you this picture because it's kind of, it's nice with this example, but again, I don't think we need it. I said this lattice was a distributed lattice. There's a fundamental theorem of finite distributive lattices, which says if you have a distributive lattice, then there's some other poset, it's called an auxiliary poset, whose order ideals generate that lattice. So in particular, again, I'll show you a picture. There's some poset whose order ideals, the order ideals, what that means is you take a poset, partially ordered set, you take some element, say A, its order ideal is everything below it. If I take A and B, everything below them is the order ideal. And they would be the elements in the lattice. That order ideal of the poset generates the lattice. So what that means is there must be some poset which is generating the stable matching lattice. And it turns out that poset corresponds to a poset on rotations. The elements in that poset happen to be the rotations. And again, I'll show you a picture in a moment, even though we don't really need it for the rest of the talk. And as I mentioned, this poset we said the rotations tell us how to go down the graph from the top of the lattice to the bottom, but the poset, partially ordered poset, is telling us which order we need to do the rotations in to get from the top to the bottom. So this rotation poset is really giving us even more information than we need. Well, this is what we really want. It's telling us not only, what are the rotations, it's like, which order should we do them? So again, let me show you a picture. Here's my 23 element stable matching. Remember, this can be exponentially big. Yep.
Do you have some situation between the length of the task and the smallest task?
These,
Have you thought about
the lengths are not going to be that long. They can be super wide. I'm not really, yeah. I mean, one interesting question, how far do you go each time someone lies and stuff? Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I suspect you could answer those sort of questions with some of these ideas, but I don't. So let me just show you. This is my lattice. This is the rotation poset. And the poset actually has 10 rotations in it. And in particular, it turns out this rotation here, row 1, is this cycle 1, 2, 3, 6. And this one, each edge in this lattice corresponds to one of these 10 rotations. So this edge is this rotation. And because this is exponentially big, some of these rotations appear many times on the left. Okay? But this one is the one, this one, row 1, is the one that takes us from M1 to M2. Similarly, the other rotations that are going to be interesting to us, that's called the maximal rotation. There could be more than one rotation at the top because this is a poset, not a lattice. It doesn't need a supremum. So you could have more than one. In this particular example, there's only one maximal one, but there are 3 minimal ones. The minimal ones kind of in reverse. If you were to start at M23 and did them in reverse, you'd get to M20, M21, and M22. Or if you were M20 and did row 8, you would get to M23. Okay. So again, and I guess where did the order ideals come from? Basically, if I picked sort of 5 and 7, if I picked 5 and 7, everything below them is 5, 7, 8, 9, 10. That piece is one of the, is going to give me one of these elements in the stable matching lattice. Okay. Again, you don't need the technical details. What we do need that are important are these minimal rotations and this maximal rotation. In particular, we need these minimal ones. These are the ones that eventually are going to get us here. Okay, so what? So here's the kind of important lemma. A coalition is winning if and only if it intersects every minimal rotation. Okay? So that means it contains a girl in each minimal rotation. Now remember, when I just defined the rotations, I just put the boys, but there's a corresponding girl with those that partners them. So what I want is, if I look at these minimal rotations, I need at least one girl in each of those minimal rotations. Okay. And why is that useful? Because what does it mean? It means if I add a girl to when I add a girl to a coalition, what's happening? When I add a girl to a coalition, it essentially forces the deferred acceptance algorithm to perform every rotation preceding and up to those that involve her. So essentially, if I have a girl, I've got to use all the rotations that contain that girl. So that means if I have the girls in the rotations at the bottom, I must reach the bottom. So that's the idea. I'm running, only got 5 minutes left, so I'll try and speed up a bit to give you some of the ideas. So if I want to get to the bottom, I've got to pick one girl from each minimal rotation. It turns out that these minimal rotations, they're disjoint. So that means if I've got 10 minimal rotations, I have to pick, the best thing I can do is pick 10 girls. So the cardinality of the minimum winning coalition is exactly the same as the number of minimal rotations. So all I need to do to figure out my solution, what's the minimum winning coalition size? It's the size of, it's the number of rotations, minimal rotations. And rather than look at minimal rotations, I'm going to switch and look at maximal rotations. In this model, everything's symmetric. When I look at this random model, So I'm going to look at maximal rotations because the expected number of minimal rotations is the same as the expected number of maximal rotations. And it turns out, why would I want to look at maximal rotations? Because what did we say about maximal rotations? Maximal rotations are the ones that are next to M1, which is the Boy optimal stable matching. The Boy optimal stable matching we've already got. The deferred acceptance algorithm's given it to us. So all I need to do is figure out what are the rotations next to the Boy optimal stable matching, which I have from the deferred acceptance. So if I can understand the deferred one run of the deferred acceptance algorithm at that point and figure out the maximum rotations, I'm going to be done. So let me quickly show you how did we find the rotation graph. What we do is we wanted to figure out if I take the emperor, who's the next girl that would accept an offer from the emperor? So imagine Thumbelina rejects him. He has to go down his list. He asks little match girl. She says no because she's already matched to her first choice. Goes further down his list to Little Mermaid. She would say yes. So this is the next girl that would accept an offer from him. If I took the ugly duckling, if Mermaid rejected the ugly duckling, he would now propose to Little Mermaid, to Thumbelina, and she would say yes. Okay, and remember, this was how I created the rotation graph. So I need an edge from who accepts the emperor next on the list. It's Little Mermaid. Who does the arc go to? Her partner, which is the duck. Who accepts the duck's next offer? It's Thumbelina, who is matched to the emperor. So there should be an arc from the duck to the emperor. So in my rotation graph, I should get these two edges. If you repeat that process with the other two characters, Sven will point to the emperor, and actually no one else, no girls would accept an offer from him. So he's on his own. So that would be my rotation graph for that particular example. I need to look at the rotation graph in general for these big random matching models. What's interesting, what you can see is obviously this has maximum out degree 1. There's only one girl that can accept an offer from you next, but possibly none will, as with the tin soldier. This resembles a random mapping graph where you just sort of have an arc randomly from one node to another. They also have out degrees, but then exactly equal to 1. That's useful because if I do a random mapping graph, the expected number of cycles or components is a half log n, which is the answer I'm trying to get. So if I can show this random mapping graph looks the same somehow as this rotation graph, then I'd be done. So if the rotation graph is similar to the random mapping graph, we're done. So that's what basically the technical content of the paper is to prove that. I think I've got 2 slides. I'll go through them and I'll finish. So how do we do that? I just need to figure out the expected number of rotations. We set up a random variable called ZB, which is 1 over the size of RB if boy B is in a maximal rotation RB and 0 otherwise. That seems a little bit odd, but intuitively it's quite simple. It says, let's say I have a rotation of size 100. It's got 100 boys in it. If I each give them value 1 over 100 and add that up, 100 times 1 over 100 is 1. That counts 1 cycle. So if I sum up the ZBs with this formula, each of them add up to 1 if they're on the cycle, and that will give me 1 rotation. So if I take the expectation of the ZBs summed up over all boys, I get the expected number of rotations. We didn't need to do it this way, but it's super messy. If we didn't figure out how to do it a different way. So this is the way we got it to work, by looking at this random variable. And how can we calculate ZB? Basically, you start at boy B and you start doing a walk along the rotation graph from some random boy. And then if it comes back to B, you're in a rotation. If it closes a cycle somewhere else, you're not in the rotation. So that will tell you what your ZB is. And so the whole technical part is to prove that this walk somehow behaves similarly to a random walk. It isn't a random walk. There's loads of dependencies going on. But if it's somehow similar to a random walk, then it will end up matching the random mapping graph. It will sort of do what we want it to do. You'll be in it with the same sort of probability. And the idea is you just saw a set of properties. Again, I'll tell you why we want these sort of properties in a second. We show the first phase, the first acceptance algorithm. This is actually well known. You have about n log n proposals in the first phase when you run the deferred acceptance algorithm with high probability. These are all with high probability, these statements. The second phase is when we calculate the rotation graph and we do that little bit about who would accept me next. And I do that random walk from B to calculate ZB. Turns out that's going to have about square root n proposals to figure that out. And during these two phases, the number of proposals received by each girl is about log n. The number of runs, a run is when we pick a boy that's unmatched and we get him to propose, we can keep picking that same boy until someone accepts. So you create a run. And the number of times you pick each boy to start proposing is about log n, 21 log n. Each of these runs, while we're doing it, he only makes about at most log n, log squared proposals, etc. Okay, why do we need that? The idea is if a girl has received too many proposals, then when a new proposal comes in, she's really unlikely to accept. So it's not sort of a random. It's been really highly a biased coin. Whereas we wanted it to be random, about 1 over n, right? That you'd accept these things. So, or depending on, essentially, if you've only had 21 log n proposals, then most of the people are still on your list. Things are quite nice. If a boy's made too many proposals or a girl's received too many proposals, things start getting messed up. Okay, so there's all sorts of dependencies going on. Because of depending on how many proposals you've had, what actually happened in when you ran the deferred acceptance algorithm and so on. But these sort of properties, if you have these sorts of properties, you can show that all these dependencies basically are really small. They add up, there's lots of them, but they don't add up to much. And then you basically end up having the same result. The probability that a girl ends up accepting a proposal, it turns out each proposal you get is probably like random. And then we kind of get a random mapping graph. So that's the technical idea. So that's the end of the talk. So if you've got any questions, thanks.
We'll also check whether we have some questions from students.
Yep.
The mechanism was fixed, right? So do you think that, I mean, if there are like, if you do a random, you choose a random mechanism,
yep.
And truth telling would be optimal, right? Because by starting with a boy or with a girl, I could still, I mean, in expectation, I could still achieve some.
Okay, I didn't understand your question. What do you mean? You start with a random mechanism. What do you?
I mean, here the mechanism was that I start with the boy.
Yeah.
Like with the preferences of the boy. Another mechanism could have been I start with the preferences of the girl.
Yep.
And if there is a, I mean, if I don't disclose, like what kind of mechanism I use at the start, then could telling me a
well, okay. So first, then it's not clear what happens, right? Because that means like half the time you should tell the truth and half the time you should lie. Basically, there is an incentive for you to lie, but how do you calculate what that would be, right? So in advance, if you're facing that mechanism, there probably is incentives for you to lie, but I don't know how you'd calculate it. I mean, in reality, so in practice with these mechanisms, so for the random matching model, it's actually okay. We don't really need to know everything. Really, normally in these matching markets, if you want to lie, you need to know everything. You kind of need to know everyone else's preferences to figure out the best thing to do. Here, you kind of don't. If you were a girl, you would say, well, I want to cut off at my stable partner, but my best stable partner is about log n. I know if I sort of give a list of sort of log n squared, I'm going to get loads of good partners there with high probability. So you could just do that without knowing anyone else's preferences. But in practice, there's this structure. It really would help to know the preferences. If you don't know the preferences, there's a big risk, right? If you lie, you might not get matched. So I'd suspect in most applications, there's not much of an incentive to lie. Or even if there is an incentive, it's the computational issue is too hard. The informational issue, you don't know what to do. But yeah, for the specific question of tossing a coin and using girl matching and then boy, yeah, I mean, the incentives are even more crazy because everyone has some incentive to lie. We just don't really know if that's dominated by the incentive to tell the truth. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I've never studied that problem. I mean, I've seen talks on it, but I've never studied it. So I don't know. I'm sure there is structure underlying it, but I don't know. I don't know what the effect is of, say, having pairwise preferences, right? How that messes up the underlying structure of the stable matchings in that system. I don't know, but there's definitely an underlying structure. So I think that the ideas are probably the same, but how you would analyze them, how you'd make use of it, I don't know. And there's also other issues because there's, I mean, I think you can get non-existence issues as well. Yeah, if you have capacity constraints, if you have partners being able to have preferences. So yeah, so the algorithms then are different. Like, so the whole point, the nice thing about this was with the structure, deferred acceptance actually also tells you how to traverse that structure. In general, if you don't, I'm not even sure what algorithms they use. I think they're often just integer programs of some sort, but I don't know. You may know. Yeah. Yeah.
So just a clarification, but we talk about that algorithm can have like a function.
Yeah.
What would happen if the y is supposed to go not?
It's automatically eject. The truncated list it's equivalent to saying you give your whole list, but at some point in the middle, you say, I prefer to be single to everybody beyond there. So it just means if someone proposes to you and they're not on the list, you're automatically rejected because you prefer to be single. So it's equivalent to just saying, I prefer to be single above all this lower part of my list. And somehow that actually helps everybody else, every other girl as well by doing that. Yeah.
So we have a question from Zoom, from Alfredo. So the model assumes that rankings are drawn uniformly, right?
Yep.
If that is not the case, does the expected size of the coalition changes? Or is there any intuition on higher distribution?
I mean, the problem is whether it's correlated. I mean, how I draw my particular list is going to, if there's some independent distribution, then there's maybe something you could say. I'm not sure. That would already be it would be difficult, but I'm not sure if the ideas, if it affects the basic ideas of the techniques we're trying to use. But if the distributions across the boys and across the girls are correlated, then everything gets messed up. But it would, yeah, and it would presumably, obviously, with certain distributions, the answer certainly changes. It's not like the half log n anymore, right? If everyone has the same ordering, right, you're going to get all the girls have this ordering, all the boys have this, or whatever. You're going to get different number of stable matching. So certainly, depending on the distribution, the answer is different, but the ideas might still apply, but not if it's correlated. It would get way harder, much harder.
I have just last question. Have you thought of because in different it's true that we prove that boys they cannot improve their own by time. But what they also show is that they cannot improve their own, but they can improve the preference of other boys. So my question is, in a crazy situation in which everyone is right, how do you boys and girls are right? If there is some way down or also if boys have incentive to form coalition in order to counterattack the strategies of the
Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, I can't answer that question. I mean, that's a good question. I don't. Like I say, I'm sure these things are so complicated. It's not in practice. It's not clear whether people probably you shouldn't strategize in a lot of applications. Whether you then want boys to strategize for some reason to counteract the fact that they know girls are strategizing, then that will get very difficult.
Probably also doesn't make sense
or it's something like this random model where you can reason about it in a nicer way. But yeah, at the moment, obviously the boys are getting the boy optimal stable matching. Unless they know exactly what the girls are doing, there isn't really any incentive for them to do anything else. Yeah. But if you start putting other, but I can't, I don't know specifics for that. I mean, yeah, I should say this is the first paper I've written on stable matching, so I'm not even an expert on this. This is so, but obviously, yeah, you can use. You can obviously use the obvious ones. You do the girl proposal, but then you're running the same algorithm. I think there's greedy approaches that do work, but again, I'm not an expert in those. Yeah, did you?
Well, I mean, there are also
yeah.
Oh, right. So, for example, I mean, we can, there are also algorithms to do matching, and sometimes we can show matching to I mean, it is proven that the direct sector fabric is more robust.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's a lot of the related problem of matching students to schools. There's sometimes a lot of different constraints, but there's a lot of different algorithms used in school matching problems too. Yeah.
Yeah, we can take other questions offline, maybe person too. And thanks Adrian for the talk, and we will attend the GERAD.